Ready? Click. And we're live. It is Wednesday, December 29th, 5:03 p.m. It is the eve of New Year's Eve, which is a kind of meta thing, but since we live in Mark Zuckerberg's universe, everything has to be meta, and so, that's how it is. Scott has a very important update for you all on the brisket matter. And so rather than doing the monologue today, I'm just going to turn it over to him for the important update to his Where's the Lie story from the other day.
So thank you very much, Ben. So the first thing to say is that I got a lot of skepticism about the story, people trying to poke holes in it, people saying there's no way there's no 25-mile-an-hour speed limits in Oakland, of which I then pointed out that 25 miles per hour is the official speed limit in residential and business districts in California with the DMV link. And other people then said there's no way you were going 95, and I said I wasn't claiming I was going 95. I was saying that the police said I was going 95. And then so I called the butcher yesterday, which I found the butcher. It was Oakland Kosher Foods, and I spoke to hey, Kate.
Hi, I'm loving this. Tell me everything. I want to know everyone and how you owned them.
All right. Well, let's let him finish.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hi, Kori.
I called Oakland Kosher Foods right as they opened in the morning, and the person who answered the phone gave me the owner. And I said that I was a customer in the late 80s. They have owned the Oakland Kosher Foods since 1987. He confirmed several things. First of all, that they do on Friday close at 3. Number two, that they sold at the time cooked brisket. Number three, they sold at the time lemon rosemary chicken. But, and this is a big but.
Did you ask for the recipe? Sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't ask. No, I should have asked for the recipe. That would have been a great idea, but because I've never been able to recreate. I've tried many times.
Said.
Right? That's exactly right. I should have done that. But I said, did you ever have a thing called brisket bonanza? And he said, no. And I said, no sign that ever said brisket bonanza? He goes, not that I can remember, and I've been the owner since that point. So,
Scott was in fact lying. The whole thing was a fraud.
No, I was not lying. So first of all, I would just point out that even if what I said was not true about the brisket bonanza, I'm not lying because I fully believe it to be true. Number two, if you look up, it's a thing called brisket bonanza. Like there's the rabbi cooks. There's a video about the rabbi cooks, how he cooks his brisket bonanza. It's like a Jewish thing. And if you doubt me, you're being anti-Semitic. All
right. So okay. All of which is a long way of saying that Scott is not allowed to have fun anymore. Okay. But we are allowed to have Kori Schake, which, as I have said before, is about the greatest surrogate for fun in the world. And in addition, Kori, who requires no introduction, but I feel obliged to say this whenever I introduce her, is the person in the world who gave me the best professional advice I have ever received. Kori,
wait, what you have professional advice?
Oh, that's a long story, and I'm not gonna tell it now. But Kori has some professional advice today. It's not just a throwaway because Kori began the day with some professional advice for Vladimir Putin. And I think because Kori does, in fact, give the best professional advice around, Putin really ought to take this. And so I thought we should explore the contours of the analysis so that Vladimir Putin has the opportunity fully to assimilate it. So, Kori, what gives? What are you suggesting for Vladimir?
So based on the excellent analysis of the Institute for the Study of War and AEI's own Current Threats Project, their judgment is that Putin can't sustain the political and economic costs of the invasion of Ukraine that appears imminent with more than 100,000 Russian troops amassed on their border and another 75,000 evidently en route. And I not only thought their analysis was interesting, it led me to believe if Putin's not planning to invade Ukraine, what might he be up to? Because there are several gains he could make short of invasion. For example, long-term stationing of Russian troops in Belarus, which would not only be a violation of the sovereignty of Belarus, unless Lukashenko consents to it, which I suspect he would, but a threat to Poland, a threat to the Baltic states, complications should NATO need to reinforce its members' territory in the Baltic states and in Poland. Splitting the NATO alliance, although happily I don't see evidence of that just yet. He could also push the Western countries which fear a conflict with Russia, including the United States, into preemptive concessions that would change the status quo in Europe to Putin's advantage. What he has asked for in these two treaties he's submitted to the United States and the NATO allies is a commitment never to expand NATO, a commitment to carry out no military training or cooperation with non-NATO members. Ridiculous on the face of it, and thankfully NATO has held a terrifically solid line on that. But Biden did make a couple of preemptive concessions. I think they were both concessions worth making. But the agreement to hold talks on Russia's preferred security structure in Europe and a public statement that the United States would not defend Ukraine militarily if Russia attacked it, which I think was an effort to limit the prospect of either war by miscalculation or spiraling up of the conflict.
But just to be clear, that second concession does not include any commitment not to arm Ukraine, right?
That's right. In fact, the United States has troops not only arming but helping train Ukrainians in the country right now. So does Canada, so do some other NATO allies. So the reason I think Putin should take my advice, unlike Putin agreeing to a judo competition with you, which of course he would lose, Ben. The reason he should take my advice is that if Russia invades Ukraine, I think it will be a successful military operation and a war he would lose, because the US and NATO allies would move to defend the territory of the Baltic states. The US only has 400 troops in the Baltics now, but we and others would double down on defending NATO allies. I think the economic and political sanctions that NATO has already agreed, including bouncing Russia out of the SWIFT payment system, would be onerous for Russian businessmen. And of course, my favorite use of the tools of free societies to protect free societies, which is transparency and regulation and the rule of law, none of which Putin can really stand as his cyber vigilantism in the aftermath of the Panama Papers release, I think, harbinges.
So, all right, I'm interested in we've talked to a number of people about this over the last few months, but I'm interested in your take. Is Putin here primarily interested in the preemptive concessions, or is he actually smelling blood in the water and says, all right, this is the opportunity to take Donetsk and, maybe not go to Kiev but to carve up the thing and to create the land bridge to Crimea and put a bunch of not so little green men in Donetsk and Luhansk. I mean, is the idea here to have that you think he's imagining actually doing this, or is the idea that to bluff us into preemptive concessions?
So I honestly don't know the answer to that. I suspect it depends on our reaction, which so far I think has been, if I were playing Putin's hand, I would look at the Western reaction and be surprised that NATO allies had come together so quickly and without meaningful dissent. I would watch the way that the public debate about Nord Stream 2 has changed in Germany. That is, no longer is it simply a business deal or a way to get out of having nuclear power plants in Germany, but now it's also a geopolitical stake acknowledged in Germany, which was feared by many people outside of Germany. So I don't know the answer to it. I think to some extent it depends on what we're doing. And I also think there have been a couple of other great things. The Secretary of Defense in the U.S. having his Ukrainian counterpart in for a visit, Congress beginning to spool up on we should be providing more arms to Ukraine. I think if Russia does invade Ukraine, I think that you will see a lot more assistance to Ukraine. Also, we shouldn't overlook the fact that the mighty Russian military and its proxies haven't done that well in Donetsk against Ukrainians fighting for their homeland. And I saw a poll just the other day that 58% of Ukrainians want to join NATO, as opposed to only 23% who do not. 24% of Ukrainians volunteered the information that they would be willing to defend their country with a gun in their hand if Russia invades. And so Russia may succeed in taking it, but fail to hold it because they don't have a very good record of countering insurgencies in Chechnya, Afghanistan, and other places.
Ben, can I ask a point of clarification just really quickly? So,
why are you asking my permission?
Oh, no, well,
that's the question.
Kori, because you're so brilliant, I never want to interrupt you. And I know so little about this, and so I'm mostly always just trying to learn from you. But I just am curious. You said there's only 400 troops, American troops, that can defend the Ukraine, and I'm just kind of curious. But you say a gun in their Ukrainians, where 24% of Ukrainians have a gun in their hand willing to defend. What is the military capacity? There can't possibly be 400 Americans with guns in their hands. What is the actual military capacity of America, to defend that border?
Okay, so let's separate out Ukraine from the Baltic states.
Okay, I might have misheard you. Sorry.
the important distinction is that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are NATO members. And so although there are only 400 troops from the United States stationed in the Baltic states, the US and 29 other countries have committed that an attack on one of them would be an attack on all of them. So you would see a massive reinforcement of the Baltic states if they had been attacked. Ukraine falling outside the NATO commitment, and President Biden having publicly assured Russia that the US would not defend Ukraine. Parenthetically, the one thing I should have said at the start and want to remind everybody is that Russia and the United States both committed to the sovereignty of Ukraine.
The old Minsk agreement.
Yes, back at the end of the Cold War, when Ukraine was willing to give up Soviet nuclear weapons stationed on its territory.
Which looks like a bad deal in retrospect. You know, if you had to turn back the clock and you said, would Ukraine be a little bit better off today if it said, you know, if Vladimir Putin had to think about whether Moscow was going to get dusted before he took Crimea, it would not, like, you know, the argument for nuclear deterrence is not crazy.
Okay, so this is, I'm understanding now this delineation between the Baltic. Okay, so I'm like, sorry, I missed that key
Yes, part. So we would rush to reinforce the Baltics because all the NATO countries are committed to mutual defense and also are really scared. You know, NATO defense spending started going up in 2014 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so, you know, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, very graciously gave President Trump credit for that. But the actuality of it is that NATO allies are really nervous about Russian aggression. And I think the speed with which you saw consensus form as Russia's threat became clear this round is a testament to that. But Tumas Ilves.
So, you know, it's not very often that I get to do the Woody Allen. I happen to have Marshall McLuhan right here, but I happen to have a Baltic head of state, former head of state, right here. What does he have to say? Tumas Ilves, welcome.
Missed you.
Well, it's great to be back here at this very late hour. And first of all, I just want to say that Kori is just fantastic, and I'm so happy to see her, be able to talk to her. But what I did want to say is that the problem with these agreements is that Russia is demanding written, permanent agreements, pledging never to expand NATO again, and all the other things that Kori mentioned, as a country that signed off on the Budapest Memorandum pledging never to invade Ukraine. So how the hell can you take this country seriously? And which is why I think that, in fact, Kori's analysis is right. I had one which went further to say this is all a ploy only to get the U.S. to take him seriously and not ignore him, and to begin talks. But he's just doing it in such a typical Putin-esque, clumsy, obnoxious way because he doesn't know how to talk to people politely.
Wait, really? This is all just like him making a big deal out of nothing? Like to try to get attention?
No, it's to get talks going, and who knows where it'll go. But I mean, they were presented as ultimata, saying that if you do not agree to everything we say, you'll have war, which is not exactly a way to, make friends and influence people.
Uh, because we live in such debased times, I'm going to bring up a tweet thread as a counter argument. But Dmitry Alperovich wrote. I'm sure people on the panel have read this thread. He made a very persuasive case for why he's so confident that Putin will invade. Dmitry is the founder of CrowdStrike, and he's a very, very knowledgeable person. And let me just raise some of the issues that he raised, and just to hear what experts think. So the first thing he mentioned is that over 100,000 troops and artillery and machinery. It's a very expensive thing to do. Either you can't keep them there indefinitely. Either you do it now, or you're going to have to leave very, very soon. The diplomatic demands that have been made by Putin have been very public and have been almost absurd in the way in which there's no way that the West can cede to them. As for the claim that the sanctions, the West will impose sanctions, the West is already constantly imposing sanctions. Russia has learned how to live with them. They took over Crimea, and the West didn't throw them out of the SWIFT banking system. Finally, that Putin is getting up in age. He doesn't have much time, probably in power left. This is as good a time as any to invade, with the world preoccupied with COVID and having stepped down from Afghanistan. There's no appetite to engage in further long insurgencies. And finally, that Russia has has centuries-long history of dealing with insurgencies in this region, and that one strategic goal would be to cut Ukraine in half, and therefore make it virtually impossible, even if there was a popular demand to join NATO, actually strategically impossible with half the country being occupied. I was wondering what Kori and Tomas thought of those arguments.
Kori?
Yes, so I have enormous admiration for Dmitry Alperovich. I think he's really smart and he's really good on these issues. And that's a strong case. I am more persuaded, though, that if Putin wanted to take Ukraine, he wouldn't leave us time to organize ourselves. I don't understand the 100,000 troops, another 75,000 making their way towards it and not doing anything. That's what made that, as much as anything else, persuaded me that this is the use of military force for political purposes, not for actual invasion. The second thing that persuades me of it is my AEI colleague Leon Aaron had a piece a couple of weeks ago arguing that, in his judgment, this is internally focused on Putin's part. That is, this is about making a play for popular support, because we did see his popularity spike among Russians after the seizure of Crimea. I do think, though, that, for example, the fact that we didn't kick him out of SWIFT after Crimea. If I were Putin, I wouldn't doubt that we would do it this time, since we just publicly announced we're going to do it this time if he invades. And it's not just the United States making that decision. NATO's much more united in response to this than NATO was in 2014, when the shock of what was happening was, the shock of the new was still taking hold. And I think the last thing is that I doubt, to the extent that Russians have the ability to affect Putin's choices, I don't think I would be confident if I were Putin that you could take half of Crimea and subdue it.
You mean take half of Ukraine?
Excuse me, yes, take half of Ukraine and subdue it. In part because the seizure of Crimea and the low simmering conflict in the Donbass has actually created Ukrainian national identity, and that national identity is Western. And so the progress they have made against corruption, the deepening of ties with the West, the strengthening of Ukraine's military, and the public commitment by NATO countries that if Russia does invade, that we will continue and ramp up the assistance we are giving the Ukrainians. Leads me, this is a close call. It's not an easy call. And while I would despair if Dmitri's right on this one, I think he may be. I come down in a slightly different place because of those factors.
So Dmitri presumably isn't saying there's 100% chance that he's right, and you're not saying that there's 100% chance that he's wrong. So
I would just say that Dmitri I think he used a highly confident.
But Dmitri always speaks in high levels of confidence. It's his rhetorical style. I mean, would he? I guess what I'm saying is what percent chance do you assign to there being a military confrontation here? If we say Dmitri's 70% confident there's going to be one, what percent confident are you that there isn't going to be one?
Probably 55 or 60% confident.
Okay.
I think this is a legitimately close call. Oh, but the one other thing I probably should have mentioned is that I think, the Russians offering these two ludicrous treaties, I can't tell whether that's a move that the starting of negotiations allows them to step down from the escalation they had engendered, or whether they're so obviously unacceptable to the United States and NATO allies that this will be that Putin will use this as an excuse to go into Ukraine, which is, I think, an argument for the Biden administration, having said we'll hold talks over it. Drag this out, leave Russia sustaining 175,000 troops in Belarus, and the Russian Western Military District, which sad news for Belarus, but better than it being a launching pad into also invading Ukraine.
Tomas, what do you think of Dmitri's claims and Kori's responses to them?
Yeah, well, I tend to side with Kori. I mean, I read his thread, which was well argued. Nonetheless, I mean, it doesn't take into account a number of things. First of all, again, the huge distrust that the West has regarding any kind of agreements with Putin after his previous behavior. A. B, the arsenal of what can be used and that has not been used for sanctions. There's a piece today by Anders Ostlund about basically saying it's cut back about 3% of GDP growth per year, leaving not much GDP growth per year for the past 7 years. But those are all fairly minor sanctions compared to, well, SWIFT is one thing. Secondly, the U.S. has banned forbidding people from buying Russian bonds on the primary market, but that doesn't do anything because they sell it on the secondary market. However, if Westerners cannot buy Russian bonds on the secondary bond market, well, you're going to have a lot of really annoyed oligarchs there who are not going to be happy. I mean, my gut feeling is more and more that we're in this kind of 1964 phase where people are getting really exasperated with Khrushchev's plans to grow corn in the Soviet Union, which led to the worst harvest they ever had. And then he was deposed in October 1964 for his, quote, harebrained schemes. And I have I mean, as much as, if I give I agree with the 55%, I also have a feeling of about 15 to 20% of just, Sechin and all these other people saying, okay, we're well enough in power, enough of these harebrained schemes by a guy who is, in his last moments or his last years, which he is, where he wants to gain some kind of place in Russian history without really thinking through what he's doing. And if that leads to major economic issues for the oligarch class around him, then it's he may have some serious problems domestically. When it comes to insurgency fighting, yes, the Russians have had a lot of experience with extreme brutality in fighting insurgencies mainly in Afghanistan and
Chechnya.
Syria and Chechnya. Okay, then on the other equation, the Ukrainians into the 1950s were having pitched tank battles with the NKVD because they kept their tanks under haystacks. So it's not as if these people are not fighters. I don't know who said it, but war is the crucible of nations. 7 years of war in Ukraine have had a completely different effect on the Ukrainian population than the past 7 years has had on the Russian population. When you have up to 100,000 Spetsnaz, special operations, whatever troops there, yes, that's not enough. But then you're going to have to bring in conscripts, and then you're going to have lots of semi trucks painted Cargo 200, which is how they put their body bags in, and that's also not something that Putin really wants to have. And finally, having a Chechnya-like mass bombing a la Grozny of Kiev is not going to win lots of hearts and minds for Russia in the least.
Should I?
Scott, go ahead.
Okay. So I think there's the strategic question here is what's going to happen, but there's the ideological question about whether, you know what, I'm going to stop because the man's here.
This is the thing about in lieu of fun. Wait, Dimitri, we can't hear you. You're muted. I've unmuted you.
I just tweeted it, Dimitri.
I was just going to join and listen in. I'm literally just up on the gym.
And then he was here. So thank you for coming in.
This started as a conversation with Kori about her Atlantic article this morning. I didn't know that President Ilves was going to show up. They started talking about why they both disagree with you about the likelihood of war, and here you are. So how much of this did you hear?
I just joined the last minute. I'm literally just back from the gym, so I wasn't prepared to be on. Sorry about that.
That's okay. You look fabulous. So make the case that Kori is and Tomas are wearing the tiara of optimism, and that Putin means military business in Ukraine, and that we should be more afraid. They're saying 55% no war. What percent war are you betting on?
Unfortunately, I'm at 90, and this is not something that I'm pleased with. I hope I'm very wrong, but I think as I showed in my thread, there is numerous indications, both on the ground, from a military deployment perspective, from the cyber intrusions that they're doing, that they're preparing for war. But most importantly is the rhetoric, both the rhetoric that they're using in diplomatic channels, but also domestically, which I'm watching very closely, of the propaganda on Russian television and Russian media that is preparing the population for war. You just wouldn't do that unless you were really serious about this being an option. And particularly with the red lines that they've portrayed, not just regarding the NATO expansion, which I think you could actually get to some sort of agreement on at least a pause of the process for Ukraine joining NATO, but the fact that they've talked about NATO advisors selling weapons to Ukraine, but also positioning of forces, NATO forces in Ukraine, I mean, not in Ukraine even, but in other NATO countries, which would definitely be unacceptable to any NATO member. So I just think that they've really cornered themselves rhetorically, and it's really, really hard to back down from this and still declare victory, both for domestic population, but also to maintain international prestige.
So I want to let Kori respond to this, but I want to first prompt you on a point that she makes in her Atlantic article and that Thomas emphasized before you came on, which is that it is one thing to have a successful military operation to cut Ukraine in half or to, eat up a bunch of it and expand the autonomous oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. It's quite another thing to hold over the long term a land bridge to Crimea or to dismember a nation that 7 years of war has really emphasized a pre-existing national consciousness for. Do you disagree with Kori that if Putin were rash enough to do what you think he's going to do, that this would end very badly for him, though perhaps even worse for the people of Ukraine?
I don't. And I think it all depends on how ambitious they get. If they get into Western Ukraine, I absolutely agree. It would be a total disaster for them. If they stay on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, it's not clear to me that it would be as bad. And if they limit.
And just to be clear for people who don't know this region, Eastern Ukraine is much more Russified and pro-Russian politically. Western Ukraine, the language gets a little bit more like Polish. It's much more the center of Ukrainian nationalism. Is that fair?
Absolutely, but also you have to appreciate the deep expertise that the Russians have fighting insurgencies. It's not just Afghanistan. It's not just Chechnya. It is Syria. Let's not forget that. But it's also Crimea. It's also Donetsk and Lugansk. There were opposition people in those regions that were pro-Ukrainian that they mopped up literally within weeks because the GRU is incredibly efficient, incredibly brutal. So is the FSB. Trust me, they are on the ground in Eastern Ukraine right now. I have zero doubt identifying people that would be potential insurgency leaders, potential opposition candidates, and they would be prepared to eliminate those people and neutralize them within hours of the invasion. They're very, very good at this in a way that, frankly, the United States is not. So I don't discount the possibility that they would actually be able to control it through ruthless mechanisms and through incredibly efficient intelligence operations in a fairly bloodless way. Again, it all depends on how ambitious they get, and I don't think that they could do it in Western Ukraine. But by the way, the Russian people have fought at least three insurgencies in Ukraine itself over the last few hundred years. Most recently in the 1920s through the 1950s, where there was a number of opposition movements, the Bandera movements and others, post the creation of the Soviet Union. So, the NKVD or the CHK that preceded, of course, the current FSB and the SVR know very well how to fight in that domain. Most of that insurgency was in Western Ukraine, by the way, which is why I think they really appreciate the difficulty of engaging there. But on the eastern side of the river, I think they could get it done.
Kori, your thoughts in response?
Hi, Dmitry. I thought your thread was super persuasive. I guess I have a couple of slightly different takes than you do. One is that I don't share your view that Russia is ruthlessly efficient and good at fighting counterinsurgencies. I don't think Chechnya goes very well for them. I don't think Afghanistan goes very well for them.
The second Chechen war?
And I do think...
You don't think went well for them?
Do they win hearts and minds? Do they create a sense of connectivity? They succeed in putting somebody they like in power and in being incredibly brutal in the doing of it. Do I think that would succeed in Ukraine? No, I don't think I do. I think Ukrainians' willingness to resist, especially as you suggest in the Western part. The second thing is that I do think since 2014, countries of the West have given a fair amount of training and assistance to the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainian military has the potential to hold their own against the Russians, which would be something I would be really nervous about if I were Putin, because trying and failing, especially with a force that large, would be catastrophic to his domestic prospects. I guess the third place I differ slightly from your assessment is the other thing I would worry about if I were Putin is that taking whatever of Ukraine he could hold will result in the NATO alliance deploying enough troops in the Baltic states and Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and maybe even Turkey to cause a net loss of security for Russia and a net loss of prestige for Russia. Maybe he doesn't care about those things and is so paranoid that he thinks that would have happened anyway, but it didn't happen. And in fact, NATO has been really cautious about having the military ability, about deploying the military ability to protect NATO member states that were formerly part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact. And so I do think those are the reasons that I come to a slightly different judgment than you do. Although, as I said before, Dmitry, I'm only 55% confident I'm right, which leaves a big gaping 45%. Oh, geez, he's really persuasive.
All right, so we're going to get Tomas to settle this. Hang on, Dmitry. We're going to go see whom Tomas finds more persuasive here in a moment. Then we're going to let Dmitry respond. But before we do either of those things, Scott has a question.
Actually, it's much more important that Tomas respond, and then I'll get it at the end. Okay.
All right, Tomas, the floor is yours.
I mean, he can be. Okay, I can grant you that all of the indicators show that he will invade. The problem is, who's thinking about what happens afterwards? I mean, this is the question, say Russia is successful at getting up to the Dnieper, subduing through brutal actions the population there with a constant insurgency going on, people crossing the river, blowing stuff up, all of that typical insurgency war stuff. And then where is he? He doesn't have SWIFT. He's cut out of the secondary bond market. Most likely, countries will be so aghast that they will go and start freezing the assets of the oligarchs. Travel for ordinary Russians will cease to exist, especially for oligarchs. It will cease to exist. People like Dmitry Kozak, who flew to Berlin today to meet, I mean, he's under sanctions, but he's still going to Berlin, having been one of the architects of the Crimea invasion. I mean, all of that will end. You will be completely isolated and pushed into the kind of situation of North Korea. Now, the only thing they will then have is cutting off gas supplies to Germany, and Germany will scream holy bloody murder. But what are they going to do? So in other words, what's the end point here?
So I want to take one piece of Dimitri's side on this, which is Jim Mattis always reminds me not to be a better strategist than your enemy. And Tumas, it may be that Putin is a tactician and not a strategist, because that's fairly consistent with prior behavior, right? That he doesn't think about the long term. He picks up gains in the short term because those accrue to more, and he's testing the edge of our willingness. I mean, he's playing the gap brilliantly between what we say we are going to do and what we are actually willing to do in Syria, in Afghanistan, and other places.
So can I respond? So let me address this one by one. So one on insurgency. Kori's absolutely right. Russians don't try to win hearts and minds. They follow the Stalin doctrine, which is it's better to be feared than loved. And it has worked very well for Stalin, as we know, to pacify Chechnya, to pacify numerous countries with absolute brutality. It doesn't work over centuries, because ultimately the nationalist movements revolt. But for Putin's lifetime, it can work very well. And it's clear, even domestically, he has chosen brutality and authoritarianism, suppressing all opposition, including even the pacified parties like the Communist Party, which for 3 decades has been allowed to exist as sort of a token opposition force. They're now cracking down even on them. So I have zero doubt that with absolute brutality, with the efficiency of Russian intelligence services, which are still one of the top intelligence services in the world, they can be very, very effective, at least in eastern Ukraine, particularly when you have a population that's relatively pro-Russian. And I have to tell you one quick story, Kori. I remember this article even today. I think it was in 2015. It may have been The Guardian. And they were interviewing this jihadist, this Chechen jihadist in Istanbul, who was on the way to Syria to fight with ISIS. And they asked him, why are you going to Syria to fight with them against the Americans and against Assad? You can go fight the Russians for your own country. And he said, well, because in Chechnya, I would be dead. He literally said, we are up in the mountains, hold up. We have to come down from the mountains into the villages to get food and supplies. And we know that the minute we come down, someone in that village is going to rat us out, because if they don't, the FSB is going to come in and mow them all down. He's literally saying it would be safer for me to be in Syria than it would be for me to be in Chechnya. So that's how the Russians today fight counterinsurgencies. I agree that in the late parts of the Soviet Union, in the disastrous 1990s, it was a very different story. But Putin has really reconstituted the Russian military, reconstituted Russian intelligence services, in many ways to model what was being done in the earliest stages of the Soviet Union, when they were extremely effective at suppressing insurgencies. So I think that they will be very brutal, but also very effective if their objectives are modest. Ukraine military being able to stand up to Russia, I just don't think that there is anyone that seriously believes that they can put up a major fight, not with the long-range fire advantages that the Russians have. They're going to use their rockets, they're going to use their UAVs, they're going to use their artillery systems to decimate in a very targeted fashion most of the Ukrainian military units that are on the eastern part of the Dnieper before the tanks even roll across the border. The Ukrainians will have no chance against that. They have nothing to match it. Their air defense systems are not that great, and they're going to be taken out within the first hours by the Russians with the very advanced weaponry that they have building up on the border there now. So I just think that the first days really of the war, it will be an air war, it'll be an artillery war, it'll be a UAV war to take down major units of the Ukrainian army, and then the tanks roll in and mop it up and push the Ukrainians to the Dnieper River. I think they can do it in 30 days, and not unlike how the U.S. has fought in Iraq too. and drive to their objectives. On NATO military deployments, Kori, I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be major NATO response in building up forces and equipment in NATO countries surrounding Russia, in part because those countries will ask for it, no doubt. But I think that Putin expects that to happen anyway. And I do think that it's been happening slowly. You could argue it's been in response to what he's been doing. Obviously, he probably doesn't see it that way, but as we know, he is very allergic to the presence of the missile defense systems in Czechia and in Poland. He thinks those can be turned into offensive weapons. Reasonable people can disagree, but it's a fear that I think he really possesses. This is not just rhetoric. We've seen more deployments of both naval deployments, ground-based deployments in the Baltics and Poland and Czech Republic. So I think he just expects that this will continue either way, and regardless of what he does in Ukraine, and it has to be taken as a given. And lastly, on sanctions, to Thomas's point, I also think that the Russians view sanctions as a given. They think that they'll be sanctioned no matter what they do, and for the most part, the sanctions have been put in place on actions that deserve to be sanctioned. But on some of the other things, we haven't been so discriminate, and in particular, on the SolarWinds hack sanctions, which was a traditional espionage operation designed to break into government networks.
There's a good piece on this by one Dmitry Alperovich in Lawfare.
Exactly. But that was a type of operation that the U.S. intelligence community would do against Russia each and every day. So when you sanction them for things that are considered to be acceptable under national norms, you just send them a signal that we will continue to sanction them. And the sanctions will get worse and worse. And that's why since 2014, they've been building a lot of resilience in their financial systems. They now have the Mir payment system, which is widely used by Russian banks to isolate them from the need to use Visa and MasterCard. They have other payment mechanisms, direct payment mechanisms with the Chinese banks. So they're not going to like it. It's going to hurt for sure. But unless we sanction their oil and gas industry, I think they'll weather it just fine. And I don't see any prospect of fossil fuel sanctions, given the fact that all of Europe is freezing right now and is highly dependent on Russian gas. We in the U.S. have gas prices are going up, and we're actually importing ourselves Russian crude oil. So I don't see the Biden administration moving on that. And without those types of sanctions, I just don't think the sanctions are going to have much teeth.
All right. We are running out of time, but Scott, floor is yours.
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad that I ceded my my question earlier, because this was fascinating debate. I want to just scope out a little bit. Instead of asking street question about Putin, I want to ask an ideological question about us, which is, to what extent do the participants in this debate right now, Tomas, Kori, Dmitry, are the strategic judgments in some sense dependent on whether you think that the West is partially or not even more than partially responsible for provoking Putin by inviting Baltics and various other neighboring countries into NATO, and that there was, of course, the realist Mearsheimer response that this was a very bad idea, that Russia, of course, is going to have to respond in self-defense. And so I'm wondering whether part of this is really a sense of Putin acting in a justified fashion, not in the way that he's doing it, but that he's doing it. It's something that any reasonable sovereign would do under the circumstances.
I suspect, Scott, that you may have found the point of unanimity among our guests, but let's find out. Kori, Tomas, and then Dmitry, in that order. Let's see what you all think of this question.
So you are right that there is a fundamental difference in judgment between Putin and the West about what constitutes security, right? For the NATO countries, it is the belief that being surrounded by stable, prosperous countries that are accountable to their citizens, that makes them secure. And we have been trying since 1991 to persuade Vladimir Putin's Russia of that, and we have not yet succeeded. But I would add one other piece, Scott, which is I reject the framing that Russia has a right to determine whether sovereign countries can make choices that make them more secure. Because accepting that Russia's perspective on this is just as valid as anybody else's means that Poland has no right to sovereignty and security, that Estonia has no right to it. So he's not only accepting the Russian view, not only is a belief that countries don't have rights they can exercise in a sovereign way, which is what Putin is arguing for Russia to have. So there is the contradiction in it that comes down to nothing more than we have the right to a sphere of influence.
Thomas.
The most fundamental principle that its predecessor state and it itself has signed off on as the successor state is that each country can decide its security arrangements itself, and that's in the Helsinki Final Act, and it's in the Paris Charter, both of which were signed by the Soviet Union, and presumably, well, I mean, since Russia claims to be the successor of all agreements, then that holds. So, I mean, they've signed off on the same principle, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, we know also what agreements mean after the Budapest Memorandum was trashed, right? In sort of Ukrainian sovereignty in perpetuity was just gone. But the point is that it's very hard to convince anyone of that. And let's even go back to the issue of why Ukraine was invaded in 2014. It was because the Ukrainians wanted to move toward the EU. It was called the Euromaidan, not the NATO Maidan. And the support for joining NATO in 2014 was like 24%. Now a majority wants to join NATO. This is all thanks to Vladimir Putin and no one else. And I think Ukraine in 2014 would have been perfectly happy to receive the beneficence of the European Union without having to worry about any kind of NATO agreement, relying upon the Budapest Agreement. Which is
Dimitri? Whoops! Sorry, I just cut you off, Thomas. You were saying you were finishing by saying
you muted him.
I said it was the best possible security agreement you can get, far better than Article 5 in NATO, because these countries agree we will guarantee your independence and security forever.
Gotcha. All right, Dimitri, do you think there's any ideological component to this dispute in terms of how much people buy Putin's the idea that Putin may have been provoked?
No, I think that NATO expansion is absolutely at the core of this. And look, let's not kid ourselves about the purpose of NATO. The reason why countries like the Baltics, like Estonia, join NATO is not to send troops to Afghanistan and to Iraq.
Protect themselves against the Russians.
It's to protect themselves against the Russians. It's an alliance that is absolutely antagonistic against the Russians. And Russia, by the way, has expressed interest in the late 90s and early 2000s, even under Putin, to join NATO, and it was frankly rebuffed. So the signals that we have sent to them is that this is not a friendly alliance that's on their borders. It's an alliance specifically designed against them. And of course, they don't like it when foreign militaries are building bases around their periphery, which, by the way, we don't like either. Do I need to remind you of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fact that Cuba, a sovereign country, decided to agree to put Russian base with offensive missiles on its soil, and President Kennedy at the time instituted a blockade, which, by the way, is an act of war. He didn't call it a blockade to avoid that, against Cuba for doing so. Let's not kid ourselves. If China were to build a military base tomorrow in Tijuana, do you think we would let that happen? We probably wouldn't invade Mexico, so I'm not in any way justifying potential invasion of Ukraine, but we would absolutely.
Though we've done it once.
Yeah, we've done it once. And by the way, we are very upset when China is building military bases in Africa and Southeast Asia, and that's really far from us. And we're still upset about that. So let's not kid ourselves that great powers are concerned when foreign militaries build up presence on their borders, and they expect, the United States expects this, Russia expects this, China expects this, that people will accommodate their interests because they are great powers. That's the nature of the world we'll live in. And by the way, this idea that countries can decide which military alliances they can join, why is it that virtually the entire world, except I believe about 13 countries then, that presumably many of them would hold that view, do not hold the view that Taiwan deserves to be recognized as a country, that we have to acquiesce to China's decision that Taiwan is going to be part of that country, and we're going to accommodate them. The U.S. does not even send high-level delegations to Taiwan, much less recognize it as a country. So we implicitly accommodate great powers on these types of topics all the time, but for some reason we have not been willing to accommodate Russia, and I'm afraid that's leading us to war. And I don't think that it was necessarily a mistake to let Poland and the Baltics and other Eastern European countries to join NATO, but I think pushing it to the limit of Ukraine, of potentially even Belarus, the Central Asian republics, that's a step too far, I think. And that is why Russia is threatening war, because most of the invasions in its history have come either through Belarus or through Ukraine, whether it's Hitler or Napoleon or the Polish invasions in the 1700s and so many others. So they know that the country is not defensible without those essentially buffer states. And that's why they're acting.
All right. I am going to let go Tomas and Dmitry. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm going to give Kori the final word, and then I'm going to take a moment of the moderator's privilege to make a couple of remarks of my own before we wrap up. Kori, you get the last word today, except for me.
I offer it right back to you, my friend.
I'm sorry?
I said I offer it right back to you.
All right. So I just want to say two things about this conversation, which is that earlier this week or late last week, the National Review decided to do a hit piece on Kori, based on the anonymous comments of some congressional staff. And I want to direct to the attention of congressional staff, named and unnamed, what happened here and why this is an example of the wisdom of AEI in having its foreign policy program run by one Kori Schake. So the first thing that happened was that Kori wrote an article that was provocative and interesting. And I asked her to come on this and talk about it. And the second thing that happened is a former head of state of a relevant country to the article showed up to engage with her about that without being asked to. There was no invitation. Tomas just showed up because he had things to talk about with Kori about this. And the third is that when the two of them started agreeing about something in a fashion that was not consistent with Dmitry Alperovich's views, Dmitry showed up to have a super civilized, interesting conversation about it and to narrow the scope of debate. And I just want to say this is think tank culture at its very highest. None of this was planned on my part, except having Kori on the show. It was just an organic expression of respect for Kori herself, but also engagement with the ideas that she was expressing. And so to my friends at National Review, this is what you're attacking. And I just want to say that. I did not consult with Kori on this, so if any of that puts her in a difficult position, A, tough noogies to her, and B, she did have nothing to do with it. We are gonna leave it there. We will be back tomorrow. Kori Schake, you're a great American.
The best American.
Dmitry Alperovich, you're also a great American. Toomas Ilves, you're a fabulous, great Estonian and a great New Jerseyite as well. No, he is. He's
from New Jersey?
Well, he lived there for a very long time. And so he's really a great American as well as a great Estonian. We'll be back tomorrow with another great American, the great Renee DiResta. And then Friday we will have our annual, and I cough up the word annual because In Lieu of Fun show was not supposed to go on for a year, let alone 2 years, enough to have an annual anything. We will have our annual New Year's resolutions edition on Friday Cheese Night. All of that will start 22 hours and 58 minutes from now. And until then, Scott?
We can't have fun anymore, but we can have incredibly interesting, civilized debates about matters of great public importance. Thank you.
Kori Schake, you're amazing. I learn so much every time you're around.
Oh, you guys are so wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.